Welcome to the Shevchenko Scientific Society. We are continuing our academic program, and tonight we will have a panel discussion about Ukrainian nationalism. Unfortunately, we're waiting for the one participant, Professor Alexander Motel, who will be later. Okay, I invite Bogdan Vetvitsky to speak. Oh, Miroslav Skandrey. Okay.
Oh. So my job is just to welcome you to this session, this discussion, which is going to include two papers and then a discussion. My job now is just to introduce Bogdan Vetvitsky, who is a lawyer, a philosopher. He's written on legal, philosophical, and historical issues. 3-4 decades ago, he wrote the first history, the first English language monograph on Slavs and Gypsies under Nazi rule, and he has followed the discussion in Ukraine and among Western scholars on nationalism. So he will give the first talk. That will be followed by my talk. By the way, I am Miroslav Skandrey. I am from Canada at the University of Manitoba, but presently visiting professor at Columbia University. And I've written on nationalism as well, including a book recently published called Ukrainian Nationalism with the Yale University Press. So, Bogdan, the floor is yours.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My presentation is the first draft of something that hopefully will end up in a much larger project on the kinds of themes that I'll touch upon this evening. 20th century Ukrainian nationalism and historiography, political judgment, and memory politics. When it comes to Ukraine's 20th century Ukrainian liberation movement, by which I mean to include the OUN, the three branches into which it's split, and the UPA, there at present appears to exist a kind of paradox, perhaps even a triangular paradox. On the one hand, the Ukrainian sociological organization Rating reported in May of this year that 71% of the Ukrainians surveyed expressed a positive attitude towards the UPA, and 81% supported recognizing OUN and UPA as participants in the struggle for national independence. As Rating also reported, this percentage has doubled since 2015 and quadrupled since 2010. On the other hand, a group of scholars and researchers in the West, including perhaps most prominently Professor John Paul Himka, his colleague at the University of Alberta, David Marples, two persons they formerly mentored, Per Anders Rudling and Grzegorz Rosoliński-Liebe, and a number of others elsewhere, has over the last decade or two seemingly been on a mission to demonize this same 20th century liberation movement. They have done so, first, with an effort to produce historiography about that movement, second, with an effort to pass political and/or moral judgment on that movement, which judgment is often integrated into their historiography, and third, with an effort to pass judgment on the memory politics that relate to that movement. By a mission to demonize or vilify, I mean a mission to characterize and define that movement as fundamentally and essentially, rather than, say, partially, temporarily, or instrumentally, as fascist, racist, xenophobic, anti-Semitic, totalitarian, and as a Holocaust participant. And then there is a third leg to this somewhat curious paradox. While a large majority of Ukraine's citizenry now takes a positive view of the underground liberation movement, at the same time that Western vilifiers have been producing books and articles to denigrate that movement, Ukraine 6 years ago had a Jewish prime minister, Volodymyr Hrozhnin. And then 3 years ago, with an electoral majority of over 70%, chose a Jewish president, Volodymyr Zelensky. And for a period in 2019, there was an overlap in tenures, and Ukraine actually had both a Jewish president and a Jewish prime minister. So what is one to make of all of this? Are today's Ukrainians somehow confused or misinformed about the liberation movement's goals and struggles? Or might it be that the Western vilifiers may somehow have gotten it wrong? Some of the vilifiers have piously insisted that history should be left to the experts, that is to say, to themselves, and that they are best placed both to unearth what happened in the past as well as to make judgments about it and about proper memory politics. Thus, for example, in a 2011 article, John Paul Himka approvingly cites an earlier article by a Sofia Gracheva, identified as a research assistant to the American historian Omer Berthoff, who mounted an attack on Ukrainian ethnocentrism, particularly in historiography. And as Himka described it, Gracheva sought to defend her reconciliation of social engagement with scholarly objectivity by claiming that, quote, a purely scholarly motivation could coincide, not be subordinated to, but actually coincide with a certain social mission, end quote. That social mission being to revise and correct Ukrainians' distorted understanding of their own history. And she felt that only professional historians had the credentials to undertake such a corrective revision. Ukrainians have also been told that failing to properly assess the 20th century underground liberation movement would further exacerbate regional divisions within Ukraine, cause damage to relations between Ukraine on the one hand and Poland and Israel on the other hand, and undermine Ukraine's desire to integrate into the EU. To suggest some preliminary answers to the question I have posed as to the seeming paradox, it would be helpful to separately address the three issues of, first, historiography, second, making political or moral judgments, and third, passing judgment on matters of memory politics. But before I do so, a few words about just how well Western historians have accurately captured Ukrainian history might be in order. For the last 70 or so years since World War II, Western academe has largely taken the position, or pretended to take the position, that Ukrainians as a nation don't really exist. Of course, no one has ever expressed this as nakedly as Russian President Putin has, but that view was in fact expressed over and over again, as reflected by the amount of attention that Ukraine received in books and articles, by the number of courses taught about Ukraine at universities, and by the type of information about Ukraine and Ukrainians provided in the courses that did touch on Ukraine, particularly in history. But, of course, as those pesky Ukrainians have insisted on the battlefield, they rather do exist. So much of academia has spectacularly been wrong. And, just to cite another rather important example, the West's leading Sovietologists still insist that the Holodomor wasn't really the Holodomor. For example, Sheila Fitzpatrick, generally considered one of the leading Sovietologists of her era, has just this year in 2022 written that, and I quote, "The present-day Ukrainian government claims this famine, known in Ukraine as Holodomor, was the result of a conscious plan on Stalin's part to kill Ukrainians. However, the results were equally devastating in southern Russia and Kazakhstan. It seems unlikely that Stalin actually wanted to kill peasants. Rather, he wanted the state to take the greatest possible amount of grain out of the villages, consistent with its peasant producers surviving until the spring sowing. The trouble was that nobody knew what that amount was, and Stalin certainly pushed local officials to go for the maximum and refused to listen when told that the peasants had no more hidden reserves. A bizarre rhetoric about peasants acting a famine and pretending to be ruined entered Soviet discourse. And by the time Stalin was finally convinced that they were not pretending but actually dying, it was too late. Entry to the towns had to be blocked against peasants fleeing starvation in the winter of 1932-33. That's from The Shortest History of the Soviet Union by Sheila Fitzpatrick. Another leading Sovietologist, Stephen Kotkin, devoted over 1,000 pages to the middle period of Stalin's political life, namely the years 1929 to 41, in his 2017 biography on Stalin. In these 1,000 pages, the Holodomor receives about 2 pages in which Kotkin asserts that, quote, the famine was not intentional. It resulted from Stalin's policies of forced collectivization, dekulakization, as well as the pitiless and incompetent management of the sowing and procurement campaigns, all of which put the country on knife edge, highly susceptible to drought and sudden torrential rains. End quote. And Kotkin also asserts that, quote, there was no Ukrainian famine. The famine was Soviet, end quote. That's from Stalin, Waiting for Hitler, 1929 to 41, by Stephen Kotkin. So these are examples, rather important examples, of what passes for leading Western academic knowledge about Ukraine.